He had never spoken a single word in 8 years, until a black nanny walked in and changed everything. His first word shocked his billionaire father and the world. The mansion sat atop the hill like a cold monument to wealth. Marble floors echoing silence, expensive chandeliers glittering above rooms filled with everything except laughter. In this palace lived Mr. Gregory Whitmore, a billionaire businessman whose life was built on numbers and power. Yet all that success could not fix one thing. His 8-year-old son Ethan had never spoken a single word. Not since birth. Doctors came and went. Therapists tried every technique. Specialists were flown in from Europe. But the boy remained mute, staring at people with intelligent eyes and a sadness that felt too heavy for such a young child. Most people whispered that Ethan was unlucky. Some blamed Gregory's coldness. Even in the house, the staff spoke in hushed voices about how the boy's silence was louder than any sound. Mr. Whitmore tried to hide his pain behind stern rules and disciplined routines. He believed emotions were weaknesses, and weakness was unacceptable in his world. Every nanny they hired quit within months. Not because of Ethan, but because of the father's rigid, unkind expectations. Then came Ruth, a black woman in her early 40s, recommended by a small agency no one had heard of. She walked into that mansion with calm eyes and quiet strength. The other staff exchanged nervous glances. Not many black women were hired in this household, not in such positions of trust. But Ruth didn't flinch. She simply nodded, listened carefully to the rules, and met Gregory's cold stare without fear. When he explained that his son didn't speak, she didn't express pity or surprise. She just said softly, "Sometimes children choose silence because no one has really heard them." From the first day, she didn't treat Ethan like a broken child. She didn't tiptoe around him or bombard him with questions. She sat with him in the garden, humming while she trimmed roses. She sang quietly while helping him with his shoes. Soft old gospel songs, songs filled with memory and sorrow and hope. Ethan watched her, curious, as if he recognized something real in her voice. Something warm in the middle of so much coldness. One afternoon, when the house was unusually still, Ruth sat near the boy and began singing a song her grandmother used to sing in the South. A song about dignity and struggle, about broken chains and rising up. Ethan's eyes widened, and for the first time he tapped his fingers on the table in rhythm. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just smiled and kept singing. Every day after that, she brought him small moments of music, never forcing, just inviting. But Gregory barely paid attention. He was always in meetings or away on business, believing that money could solve problems if he just threw enough of it. Sometimes he'd stand at the doorway and see Ruth singing softly to his son, and he'd walk away, almost irritated by what he didn't understand. One evening, the mansion hosted a gathering of wealthy elites. Men in tailored suits and women dripping diamonds filled the hall, laughing about investments and golf clubs. Ethan sat in a corner like a forgotten statue. Ruth kept him company, even though she wasn't supposed to be in view during such events. Mr. Whitmore saw her and frowned, but Ethan reached for her hand. And for a rare moment, Gregory said nothing. As the night went on, Ethan tugged at Ruth's sleeve gently. She knelt down. The music from the grand piano in the hall played faintly through the walls. Ruth whispered, "You want to sing?" Ethan didn't answer, couldn't answer, but his eyes were pleading. She took a deep breath. She began to hum the melody she had taught him in private, a melody full of old sorrow and survival. Ethan watched her mouth carefully, then pressed his lips together. Nothing came out, but Ruth kept singing. Slowly, his hand moved in rhythm, his eyes shining with something powerful, something that looked like a voice trying to be born. Suddenly, Mr. Whitmore appeared at the door, noticing the two of them. His face tightened. "What is going on?" he asked sharply. The humming stopped. Ruth stood up calmly. "We were just singing a little," she replied. "He seems to enjoy it." Gregory scowled. "This is not appropriate. He doesn't need lullabies. He needs discipline." He took his son by the arm and led him away, while Ethan looked back with a silent cry in his eyes. That night, Ruth sat on the edge of her bed in the servant quarters, tears in her eyes. Not because of Gregory's harshness, she had endured far worse in her life, but because she saw how much pain lived in that child, and how desperately he wanted to break free of the silence he'd been locked in. She prayed quietly, asking God to help that boy find his voice. 2 days later, something happened that no one expected. Ethan was walking down the hallway when he heard Ruth singing in the kitchen as she washed dishes, her voice echoing softly. He paused, his small hands trembling. Then he walked into the doorway and stood there. Ruth turned, surprised, but she kept singing. Ethan closed his eyes and tried again. A tiny sound escaped his throat. A sound so faint it was like a whisper of wind. But it was a sound. Ruth froze, tears filling her eyes. She knelt down. "Sing with me, baby," she whispered. And slowly, painfully, Ethan tried again. This time it was clearer, still broken and fragile. But it was a note, a real voice. Ruth felt her heart explode with joy and pain at the same time. At that exact moment, Gregory was passing by and saw them through the doorway. He stopped in his tracks. He watched his son produce sound, for the first time in 8 years, while a black nanny knelt beside him, tears of pride streaming down her face. The billionaire felt something crack deep inside him, something he had buried under layers of arrogance and prejudice. He didn't know whether to speak or to fall to his knees. For a long moment, Gregory stood frozen at the doorway, watching a miracle unfold before his eyes. The sight of Ethan trying to sing, fragile voice trembling, face flushed with effort, shook him so deeply that even he, a man armored in pride, felt his breath catch. Ruth turned and saw him standing there, but she did not stop encouraging the child. She gently placed her hand on Ethan's back and kept humming the melody, her voice soft but firm, like the sound of a heart refusing to be silenced. The boy opened his mouth again, and though only a faint, cracked sound came out, it was real. Gregory stepped into the kitchen slowly, almost as if he were approaching something sacred. He stared at Ruth, confusion and disbelief swirling in his eyes. "What did you do?" he asked, half accusingly, half in awe. Ruth wiped her tears with the back of her sleeve and stood up straight. "I didn't do anything except let him feel safe," she replied quietly. "He is speaking through song, because song doesn't judge him." Gregory had no words. For someone like him, power was tangible, money, property, control. But this was a kind of power he couldn't measure or buy. He looked down at Ethan, who now gazed up at him with a strange mixture of fear and expectation, like a child waiting to see if his father would embrace this fragile miracle or crush it under his usual coldness. In that instant, something shifted behind Gregory's eyes. He reached out and gently placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Ethan flinched at first, but then relaxed ever so slightly. It was the first time his father had touched him with genuine tenderness. That evening, the house's atmosphere changed just a little, like a window opening in a dark room. Gregory called off his meetings for the next day, something his employees had never seen him do. He stayed home, wandering the halls as if trying to figure out what kind of world he had been living in all these years. He watched from a distance as Ruth and Ethan sat by the window, humming songs together, Ethan occasionally making a small sound. He didn't speak actual words yet, but the sounds were getting stronger, like a bird learning how to use wings. Still, not everyone in the household was comfortable with this transformation. Some staff whispered resentment, that the black nanny had somehow become too important, more influential than they liked. One of the older maids muttered to another, "We've had nannies before, none of them did any of this miracle nonsense." A butler sneered quietly. She's just using old tricks. The boy's making noises, that's all. But deep down, even they knew something bigger was happening, something they couldn't deny. A week passed. Gregory tried to interact more with his son, though awkwardly. He sat at the dinner table rather than leaving early. He watched as Ethan drew pictures and showed them to Ruth. Gregory tried to smile, though it looked rusty, as if he had forgotten how. One evening, as Ruth sang a gentle lullaby, Gregory hesitated at the doorway and then did something unimaginable even to himself. He sat down beside them. Ruth looked at him, slightly surprised, but said nothing. Ethan looked between them, confused but curious. Ruth continued the melody. Without thinking, almost in a whisper, Gregory began to hum along. It was out of tune, clumsy, but it was the first time music had touched his lips in years. Later that night, as Ruth passed Mr. Whitmore in the hallway, he stopped her. His voice was quiet, almost unsure. "Thank you," he said. 2 simple words. Ruth nodded respectfully. "He's starting to trust," she replied gently. "But he needs something from you too." Gregory looked at her with tired eyes. "What?" She answered. "He needs to know that his voice matters. If he speaks and no one truly hears him, he will retreat again." Gregory didn't sleep that night. He remembered a time long before wealth and power, when he himself used to sing as a boy. When his own father told him to stop dreaming, that music was for fools. He had locked away that part of himself, and maybe punished his own son for the softness he had once lost. Ruth's words haunted him. Let him feel heard. The next morning, Gregory knocked gently on Ethan's door. The boy was sitting on the floor with crayons. Gregory sat beside him quietly. For a while, he said nothing, then whispered, "Can you sing for me?" Ethan's small shoulders stiffened. He looked toward the door where Ruth usually entered. But she wasn't there this time. Gregory cleared his throat and did something Ethan never expected. He began humming Ruth's song, softly, shakily, but with sincerity. Ethan's eyes grew wide. Slowly, he joined in, a tiny sound emerging. Gregory didn't stop. He kept humming. A single tear rolled down Ethan's cheek, while another rolled down Gregory's. It was the first time father and son had ever shared anything real. In the following days, word spread through the mansion staff that Ethan was making sounds in front of his father. People were astonished. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was the nanny's doing. But to Gregory, it felt like a second chance at fatherhood, maybe at life itself. One afternoon, he called Ruth into his study. "I owe you more than I can express," he said quietly. "You've done something no doctor or therapist could do." Ruth shook her head gently. "All children have a song. Someone just has to listen." Gregory paused. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Not as an employee, not as someone beneath his status, but as a human being who carried strength and dignity. "Ruth, I want you to stay. Not just as a nanny." She raised her eyebrows. "What do you mean?" Gregory hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, as someone important in his life. Someone important in this house." Ruth's voice remained steady. "As long as Ethan is heard, I will stay. But I will not stay if he is silenced again by this house or by anyone in it." Her words were firm, uncluttered by fear. Gregory nodded. He respected her for it. But outside that warm change, an unsettling force was brewing. One evening, 2 of Gregory's business associates visited, men with old money and older prejudices. They noticed Ruth walking with Ethan in the garden. One of them scoffed. "I didn't know you hired nannies like her." The way he emphasized the word carried poison. Gregory stared at him coldly. "She saved my son's life," he said. "Show some respect." The man chuckled, clearly not expecting such a response. But Gregory's face turned steel. "If you can't respect the people under my roof, You don't belong under it either. The associates exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen him speak with such conviction. Something had changed in him. Something dangerous to their old way of thinking. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's voice began to take shape more clearly. He still rarely attempted words, but the fragile sounds he made had rhythm now. Sometimes even forming a short hum that lingered, almost like a question awaiting an answer. Ruth continued to guide him with extraordinary patience, never rushing, always allowing him to find his own tempo. She understood the power of being seen without judgment, and Ethan felt that deeply. There were moments when he would rest his head on her shoulder, which spoke louder than any sentence he had never spoken. Gregory, meanwhile, faced a different kind of confrontation. He found himself torn between the world he had always known, where status and social expectations dictated behavior, and this new reality unfolding in front of him, where his son's first attempts at sound were teaching him more about love and humility than any billion-dollar deal ever had. Ruth's presence made him rethink things he never questioned before. He noticed how the staff treated her differently, some with quiet admiration, others with bitterness masked as politeness. The way she carried herself with dignity cast a spotlight on the prejudices that had existed unchecked in his own home. One evening, as Gregory was reading in the living room, Ethan slowly approached him, holding a small drawing. It was a crude sketch of 3 figures: a small boy, a tall man, and a woman, all standing together with musical notes floating above them. Ethan placed it on Gregory's lap. Something in Gregory's stern face softened. "Is this us?" he asked gently. Ethan nodded, eyes shining. Gregory reached out and hugged his son, perhaps not smoothly, but with genuine warmth. The boy leaned into him, and his silent understanding carried more tenderness than any words could. The next morning, Gregory called a meeting with the entire household staff. They gathered in the grand hall, puzzled and curious. He stood at the center, his voice firm but calm. "From today forward," he declared, "Ruth is not just an employee here. She is the person who helped save my son's life. I will not tolerate disrespect or discrimination of any form." There was a ripple of silence. Some nodded, others looked uncomfortable, but no one dared object. Greg continued, "If any of you have a problem working under the same roof with kindness and humanity, you may leave today. You will still be paid your due salary." No one walked out, though a few lowered their heads in shame. Ruth stood quietly at the doorway, listening but not reacting. Gregory turned to her and said, "Thank you for reminding this house what it means to be human." She nodded once, appreciating the intent more than the words themselves. However, change rarely comes without resistance. One of Gregory's senior managers, Mr. Carter, who had always harbored silent prejudice, felt threatened by Ruth's growing influence. Behind closed doors, he whispered to others that the nanny was overstepping her bounds, and that Gregory was becoming weak. He arranged a private meeting with a few of Gregory's investors, men who also believed that power should remain in certain hands only. They pressured Gregory, saying that allowing a domestic worker to have such sway in his household was bad for his reputation and elitist image. "You're sending the wrong message," one investor remarked. "People might think you've gone soft." Gregory listened, but something in his eyes had changed forever. "If compassion is weakness, then perhaps I was never as strong as I thought," he replied coldly. Ethan spoke for the first time because he felt loved and safe. She gave him that. "If that bothers you, you may take your investments elsewhere." The room fell silent. The investors were stunned. Gregory, the once ruthless billionaire, was willing to risk their money for something as intangible as dignity and justice. Some left angrily, but others stayed, quietly reevaluating their own beliefs. That same afternoon, Ruth found Ethan sitting at the piano in the music room, touching the keys softly, fascinated by the sound. She sat beside him and played a simple melody. Ethan watched her hands closely, then pressed a key himself. The note echoed lightly. "Beautiful," Ruth whispered. Ethan smiled. A real smile, bright and full of life. A smile Ruth had never seen before. Just then, Gregory entered and watched silently from the doorway. Ethan felt his presence and looked up at him. For the first time, without being asked, Ethan pressed a few keys and hummed faintly along, offering his father a sound like a fragile gift. Gregory's throat tightened. He walked over and sat beside them. Ruth began to play the melody again, slower this time. Ethan hummed along, louder now, with growing confidence. Gregory listened, tears silently falling onto his hands. Later that evening, the household witnessed a sight that seemed impossible just weeks before. Gregory, Ruth, and Ethan were sitting together at dinner. No business talk, no harsh commands. Just a quiet meal shared in peace. Ethan even made a tiny laugh when Ruth told a gentle, funny story from her childhood. That small sound, that laugh, rang through the dining room like a bell of victory. But not everyone accepted this change easily. Mr. Carter, consumed by bitterness, spread rumors outside the mansion, mocking Gregory for letting a black nanny control his household. One day, as Ruth walked through the local market to buy fresh fruit, she overheard two strangers laughing, repeating things Carter had said. That billionaire lost his mind, letting his son be raised by some gospel-singing maid. Ruth didn't react outwardly, but inside she felt a deep ache. Not for herself, but for how society still reduced people like her to stereotypes, ignoring the humanity and love she offered. She returned to the mansion, trying to hide her sadness, but Ethan noticed. He had become attuned to her emotions in ways words couldn't explain. He gently reached for her hand as if to say, "I'm here." Ruth smiled weakly and squeezed his hand back. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the estate, a story was spreading, one the tabloids couldn't resist. Mute billionaire's son speaks after bonding with black nanny. Some reported it with warmth, others with scandalous spin. Gregory saw the headlines. A younger version of him might have panicked, worried about his reputation. But the man that now lived in that house looked at the articles and felt only one thing: pride. Because for the first time, his son had a chance to live fully, and that mattered more than public opinion. The weeks that followed were transformative. Ethan's sounds grew stronger, more purposeful. Small words began to emerge alongside his humming. At first, it was only single syllables, ma, pa, no, but soon they became short phrases, whispered but deliberate. Gregory, once a man who measured success only in dollars and influence, found himself holding his breath, listening to every sound as if it were a treasure. Each syllable from his son carried not just hope, but a quiet defiance against years of silence and neglect. Ruth remained the patient anchor in this sea of change. Every day she sat with Ethan, not just teaching him melodies, but listening, encouraging him to use his own voice. She knew the true lesson was not in perfection, but in courage. The courage to speak when the world had made him believe silence was safer. Her own life had been a series of obstacles, moments where dignity was challenged, and she recognized the same struggle reflected in the boy's wide, intelligent eyes. One evening, Gregory returned unexpectedly from a business trip. He had spent the week wrestling with his own conscience, reflecting on Ruth's influence and the purity of the bond she had formed with his son. As he approached the music room, he saw Ethan at the piano, fingers moving with increasing confidence, humming along with Ruth's guiding voice. Something inside him swelled with emotion. He realized that no amount of wealth could have unlocked this door. Only patience, respect, and love could. "Ethan," Gregory whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The boy paused, glancing up, fear mingled with curiosity in his gaze. Ruth gave him an encouraging nod. Then, softly, Ethan said a word, his first full word, "Daddy." The sound was fragile, but it resonated through the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Gregory's knees almost gave way beneath him. He dropped to one knee, tears running freely, and embraced his son, holding him as if to shield him from all the years of misunderstanding and neglect. Ruth stood nearby, smiling quietly, letting the moment unfold naturally. She felt no pride for herself, only immense pride for the boy who had chosen to rise, despite all the silence imposed on him. "He's ready now," she whispered. Gregory looked at her with gratitude, respect, and something deeper, an understanding that she had done more than teach a child to speak. She had restored a family's humanity. The next days were marked by steady progress. Ethan began to use simple sentences, asking questions about the world, commenting on his drawings, even laughing in ways that lit up the mansion like sunlight. Gregory adapted slowly but deliberately, learning to listen, to respond, to embrace vulnerability. It was not easy for a man so accustomed to control, but the rewards were evident in the sparkle of his son's eyes. He started spending hours not in meetings, but at the piano, sitting beside Ethan and humming along. The mansion, once cold and oppressive, began to feel alive, imbued with the rhythm of shared love and understanding. But the external world had not entirely caught up. Gossip continued to circulate about the nanny's influence over a billionaire's household. Some whispered that Gregory had been manipulated, that his ego had been subverted by someone of lower social standing. One evening, Gregory received an invitation to a high-profile gala, a gathering of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures. He glanced at Ruth and Ethan, seated at the edge of the grand hall, Ethan practicing a short melody on a small keyboard. He made a choice that stunned his peers. He accepted the invitation, but he came accompanied by Ruth and Ethan. Together, they entered the hall. The room went quiet as the billionaire walked in with his son at his side, and the black nanny in her place of honor. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gregory's posture was firm, confident, but it carried something that few had ever seen in him before: humility. When a curious guest remarked, "Isn't that unusual?" Gregory smiled calmly. "Extraordinary, actually. My son is speaking for the first time in his life. He is learning to trust, and the person who helped him do that deserves respect, not because of status, but because of humanity." The words echoed with authority, cutting through ignorance and prejudice alike. Many in the room shifted uncomfortably, realizing that Gregory's wealth could not protect him from truth, and that he had chosen to embrace it rather than hide. Ethan's voice continued to grow, singing and speaking with a newfound courage. Ruth remained his steadfast guide, but the boy now possessed the confidence to use his voice on his own. One afternoon, Gregory watched from the doorway as Ethan sang an old song Ruth had introduced to him. The melody was strong, filled with pride and dignity. Ruth's eyes glistened, knowing that the child's voice was no longer confined by fear. Gregory felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. His son was alive in every sense, emotionally, spiritually, and socially. It was more than a personal victory. It became a quiet lesson for the entire household and beyond. People began to notice the transformation not just in Ethan, but in Gregory himself. The billionaire who once believed in control above all else had learned the power of empathy, patience, and respect. Ruth's courage and dignity had challenged centuries of assumptions, and in doing so, she had created a ripple effect, proving that influence is not dictated by wealth or race, but by integrity, love, and resilience. One quiet evening, Gregory, Ruth, and Ethan sat together by the garden fountain. The boy hummed a familiar tune, then looked up at his father and spoke clearly, "I love you, Daddy." Gregory's heart swelled, the words echoing with a lifetime of meaning. Ruth smiled, satisfied that her mission was complete. Not as a nanny who taught a boy to speak, but as a human being who nurtured courage, dignity, and self-expression in a child who had been silenced far too long. In that moment, the mansion was no longer a monument to wealth, but a home built on respect, love, and justice. The story of Ethan and Ruth would ripple quietly beyond those walls, a testament to the power of belief, the courage to act, and the dignity inherent in every Black life. And for Gregory, it was a lesson that wealth alone could never teach. The voice of a child finally heard is more precious than any fortune, more transformative than any empire. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of courage, dignity, and justice from Black lives straight to you. Join us, and let's celebrate voices that were once silenced.